Welcome back, everyone. We've reached the final stages of the 17th Eurasian Media Forum with our 8th session. As we wrap up 3 very informative days, we look to the future and explore how it might take shape in a world that's already changing by the number of rapid advances in technology, as well as the adjustments we've all had to make during a global pandemic. This session is entitled, "The World in a Future Already Arrived." And it's my honor to introduce our moderator for this session, a homegrown talent, Kazakh journalist, Lyazzat Shatayeva.
Thank you, Riz. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the last, but arguably the most important session of the 17th Eurasian Media Forum, which will focus on futurology, or how technology shapes our common future. And today I am joined by a panel of brilliant thinkers. Dr. Koert van Mensvoort, an artist and scientist and author whose work focuses on a philosophical concept of next nature that argues that the technological environment has grown so complex, so omnipresent, and so autonomous that it should be called nature of its own. Next, we have Marta Peirano, a writer and journalist based in Spain, international expert in technology and digital art, author of The Enemy Knows the System, a critical essay and later turned into a book that explores the undemocratic and really opaque ways the tech companies mishandle and use information provided by the users. We are also joined by brilliant Evgeny Chereshnev, one of the leading international experts in the fields of user rights and freedoms, privacy issues, digital footprint management, innovative application of big data, and Internet of Things. We have our online guests from afar. Joining us from Japan, Mr. Hiroshi Ishiguro, an inimitable roboticist who focuses on developing human-like robots. And one of his the most recent works is the most fascinating one, who's just grabbed the attention of the world media, is a robot that resembles himself and coined as Geminoid HI1, and I'm really looking forward to discussing some of the latest developments by Mr. Ishiguro. From Scotland, we are joined by a visual artist, Paterson. She focuses on exploring how humans interact with their environments through sophisticated technologies. Some of her works are fascinating. She's broadcast the sounds of a melting glacier live. She's also sent a recast meteorite back into space. Dear speakers, panelists, welcome and thank you for being with us today. And before we dive into the discussion, I'd like to introduce the structure of the session that we're about to have. We are going to give 5 to 7 minutes to each of our speakers to have some opening remarks and statements. Later we will dive into some of the statements and ideas voiced during these speeches and go and discuss what really technology and future holds for us, for human beings. We will also have a Q&A session, so if you have a question, please make sure to submit it or leave it in the comment section if you're watching us online. Dear panelists, thank you for being with us once again. And let's start with you, Mr. Koert van Mensvoort. Sorry, Koert. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Lyazzat. While we are here together at this very moment, there are more people flying in airplanes than lived on Earth 70,000 years ago. What happened? We as humans, we used to be a kind of insignificant species on the planet with very little impact compared to gorillas or fireflies. But then, with our imagination, our creativity, our inventivity, we started to manipulate our environment a long time ago, of course. And we became so impactful on our planet. Right now, or recently, scientists have calculated that the sum of all technology on our planet, so that's your mobile phone, but also your computer, houses, airplanes, the sum of all technology weighs more than the sum of all life on the planet. Plants, animals, microorganisms. The technosphere is now heavier than the biosphere. And this is happening in our lifetime. And of course, we can also all feel the impact of technology. Everyone, you know. You feel it in your own life. You have to cope with technological change. You, me, you, everyone. So this is an important conversation also to have. And I think we have work to be done because our understanding of technology at this moment is really quite limited. If I walk on the street right now and I ask people to give me examples of technology, they will mention smartphones, computers, internet, blockchain perhaps. These are all inventions that were made during our lifetime. So that's also as if we have this informal, unspoken definition of technology that is everything that has been invented after I was born. Or sometimes it's even worse, that people have a feeling or an image of technology. Technology, that's everything that doesn't quite work yet. And this is very limiting, because technology is much more than that. Take, for example, the alphabet. The fact that we as human beings can read and write. This is an ancient information technology that was invented a long time ago, and it enables us to make our thoughts and speech permanent in the physical space. It's applied everywhere, you know, books, displays, billboards, graffiti even. And as a child you have to invest to learn how to read and write, but then you forget about it. It just works. It's very elegant. Another example of a technology that we don't recognize as a technology anymore would be clothing. Some centuries ago, a genius ancestor invented that you could turn a fur into a coat. And there was not a Nobel Prize at that time, but he or she would have definitely deserved it. Right now I can still ask if there's anyone in the room that does not have a smartphone, but it would be silly to ask if there's anyone in the room who does not use clothing technology. This is something we humans do. So this technology was invented a very long time ago, but now it's part of our humanity. It's part of who we are as human beings. Another example would perhaps be agriculture, introduced some 10,000 years ago, and today with 7 billion people on the planet, without agriculture that would not work anymore. It's also part of what we do as humans. Or the most ancient, the first invention, so to say, that's like 200,000 years ago, the invention of cooking, that we domesticate fire and cook our food. That was a technology then, and that also changed who we are. Because of cooking, we could intake more calories in less time, grow bigger brains, and basically become modern human beings. Here we learn that the new technologies, in the beginning, they're always artificial, alien, a bit weird. What should we do about it? Hey, let's have a conversation. But once they're successful, they become more familiar. And if they're really successful, they become part of who we are as humans. So I would say any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from nature. It becomes part of our human nature. And this is, of course, important to know if we look at the digital technologies that are changing our society and our world today. How will they develop into the future? We're not only making choices for our lives, we're also making choices for all the generations to come. So that's a big burden. But if we're not ready to do it, then we would have better stayed in our caves as humans, and we did not do it. We are now co-evolving with technology. Just like the bees and the flowers also co-evolved. The bees take the nectar from the flowers, but they also spread their pollen so that the flowers can replicate. We help technology to replicate on our planet. And next to the biosphere that we know is already on our planet for billions of years, Now this technosphere is evolving on our planet. And this was not our big plan as humanity, but it's happening now. And we better steer it in the right direction and also try to balance it with the biosphere that's already there. I think in the end, the most important thing is that we steer towards humane technology. That we basically ask with every new gadget in our life and every new technology in our life, we ask ourselves the question, is this a humane technology? Does this enlarge my senses or numb them? Does this empower people or outsource them? Does it reflect human needs or not so much? Does it fit our intuition? Does it feel natural? And also does it realize dreams that we will have of ourselves? The only thing we can predict about the future is that things will change. And I hope by selecting the right technologies to thrive, we can find a path towards the future that's not only to the benefit of humanity, but also all the other species and the planet at large. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a very optimistic take on Koert's part. I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Ishiguro-san. Ishiguro-san, the mic is yours. Please take it away.
Hello, everybody. So let me talk about my statement. I want to share my screen, and so probably this is it. Okay, can you see my slide?
Yes.
So what I'm studying is interactive robots. So these are my robots. I have created this robot software. You know, my goal is to create this kind of human-robot symbiotic society in the very near futures, especially in Japan. Our population is going down to the half of the current population within 50 years. And therefore, that we need to have a more support by robots, right? So, and in order to achieve, in order to develop the human-robot symbiotic society, I have started my project, robot project in 2000. And I have created these very human-like robots and, well, just cute robots or many robots, okay? And then, just a moment. You know, basically these robots are very human-like. So why do we need humanoid robots? So my answer is the human has a brain that recognizes humans, and the ideal interface for the human is a human. Therefore, the information media devices such as talking rice cookers should be at least, you know, the partially human-like. And conversely, to understand humans, very human-like robots, androids are needed. This is the you know, very important things. And you know, because of this, so we want to have you know, the human-like robots, and we want to understand humans by using a robot. So this approach is formally called constructive science with intelligent systems. So past brain studies have found that human intelligence comprises elements of memory and computation, inference, learning, etc. The challenge is to identify how these elements can be put together to realizing the human intelligence. The constructive approach will reconstruct the robots and androids to model humans and use such robots and androids to study the human macro level or meta level, the functions. So now we are focusing on these meta level functions of humans and robots. We are trying to implement real human-like intelligence and embodiment and multimodal integration and the intention desire. So this is also very important. So you know, in the near future, we expect to have fully autonomous robots and autonomous driving system, but that autonomous system need to have you know, the decision-making system. That is the intention desires. And then the consciousness. Consciousness is very important research topics for the next decade, right? And once we can feel the consciousness through the interaction with the robot, probably we can have better social relationships with the robot. Okay, so in order to investigate these important functions of robot, I have created the you know, the very human-like robot software. right? So this robot, this is the most human-like Android, I believe, right? So everything is synthesized, the voice is synthesized, and this Android can handle the more than 150 topics. Now, of course, the purpose and the situation is quite limited. The Android is sitting in the front of a lobby and talking with the visitors, right? So, in the first contact, we do not have a deep conversation. Therefore, the Android can focus on the simple conversations, but Android can talk about the 150 topics, and usually the people can have 5 or 10 minutes the conversation together. Let me show you the sorry, what the one more example. Okay. And actually, around the 30% of people, they couldn't they believe that this Android is operated by a computer. So they consider that this Android operated by a human. That means that the conversational level of this Android is quite human. And this is the more impressive robot. A child Android robot can talk around. In the near future, I think we're going to use this kind of robots in our real societies. Okay? And then our final goal again is to realize this human-robot symbiotic societies. So the important meaning of a human-robot symbiotic society is we're going to have many chances to deeply think about the humans through the interaction with the robot. If we can feel some human-like things like emotions as a consciousness through the interactions, then we can deeply think about, consider about what is the consciousness of the human, what is the emotion about humans. So, and we can have convenient societies, technology-rich societies with the robots, but at the same time, we're going to have many chances to deeply think about humans. So that is the important meaning of our robot society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ishiguro-san. This was a fascinating presentation, which many of the topics you have touched upon in the presentation. We will come back and really go in depth. I'd like to give the floor to Marta. Marta, please.
Thank you. So I normally avoid panels about the future because, as Niels Bohr used to say, predictions are really hard, especially when they are about the future. But also because, as a journalist, I am not a visionary. We journalists, like visionaries like my co-panelist, Ishiguro-san, they are makers, they are transformers, they push their will into the future and they change it. And us, media people, journalists, we are more like prophets. We don't make things, but we read the signs. We are readers. And so after 20 years working in the fields of technology and culture, my two favorite sources of signs to read are, for the future, for the prediction of the future, are infrastructure and history. And when it comes to infrastructure and more likely critical infrastructure, first, I think we need to define what critical infrastructure is today and in what ways we are investing in it and who are we selecting to build it for us. And so one of the main, signs that we need to read, I think, comes in the shape of contradictions. And I have written a few notes just for the sake of brevity. But for instance, I'm thinking about how so many cities have been pledging to confront global warming and to tackle emissions while announcing, for instance, at the same time, airport expansions and all sorts of infrastructure that somehow contradict their goodwill. And also, I'm thinking about CEOs pledging respect, to say some word, for citizens' identity and data and biometric data, while at the same time selling handheld devices and wrist devices that not even the Interpol or the FBI would be able to place on a criminal on their wrist or their ankle. And this is because their big contribution to humanity, in his own words, will be to health. I find that very scary. Also, there is the promise of automation that sells AI-heavy company solutions to AI-less factories and administrations and cities, while their artificial intelligence is, as Professor Kate Craffer explains in her super brilliant book, Atlas of AI, is not artificial and not intelligence because it's heavily dependent on manual labor and the slave-like conditions of metal and rare earth extraction from the earth, but also the mostly unpaid or very little paid brain power of citizens in their training and moderating for the algorithms. And so the digital platforms that claim to be investing in sustainable and relatable and resilient and inclusive infrastructure for all of us are at the same time being sued for avoiding taxes, exploiting workers, misusing users' data, and even destroying democracy, at least since 2016. And so all the while extracting resources and polluting the air, the land, and water for all of us. And yet, budget-tight cities tend to hire the services of these cities and administrations and organizations of all kinds. They tend to rely on the services of these big platforms because they seem to offer cheap, effective, efficient management solutions for all kinds of problems from, I don't know, like city traffic to health management. And so these are the signs that I see in infrastructure, and history tells me that the signs have appeared before, that these contradictions are not new. And it also tells us that centralized management of the sort that is based on surveillance and extraction and quiet censorship can only lead to one kind of government, and it's never the kind of government that benefits or protects all of us, or at least most of us. And so I'm a prophet, but I'm not a doomsayer. I see extremely challenging problems ahead, but I do firmly believe that technology can help us to have a better future for most of us. We are reaching a scenario where real-time planetary scale computation is happening, and we definitely need it because we need planetary scale coordination and action in order to tackle the climate problem, which is our main problem ahead. And as Professor Matthew Pye was exposing yesterday in his panel about climate, we do have a carbon budget that is not undefined. It is exactly 233 gigatons before we cross the 1.5 degrees scenario, not a good scenario. So we do need planetary scale computation in order to measure it and in order to effectively put the changes in motion that will help us avoid that. But this new infrastructure, not only in order to be fair and just for all of us, but in order to actually work, it does require that it's based on coordination, shared protocols and values, and not in a totally centralized and opaque management platform that is literally designed to avoid taxation, to avoid legislation, and to avoid responsibility. So these tools, their tools, are definitely not designed to help us manage the climate challenges. They're more clearly designed to help some people manage us during the climate crisis. So I think this real-time planetary scale computation system needs to be publicly funded, it needs to be publicly owned, it needs to be totally transparent, locally managed, and globally shared, and it needs to adhere to the fundamental principles of justice and the fundamental principles of science. So history, my second source of science, tells us that it's not something big tech corporations are capable of doing because it's just not in their nature. So I think we are definitely at a crossroads. Many institutions and administrations are thinking of ways to rebuild their systems and infrastructures and their protocols. And I would hope that we know enough already about the nature of this enormous technology companies to avoid their cheap and efficient services. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. And as a fellow journalist, I want to thank you for the perspective that you brought in. Me too, I'd be very much inclined to thinking the pragmatic side of things, which is why I could never be a scientist or an artist. That is why I'd like to hear from Katie, who's joining us from Scotland, on how art helps us make sense of the world that is ever-changing.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yep, super, yeah. So I just wanted to give a short overview of the kind of work that I make and where I'm coming from. I create artworks that deal with space, light, time, nature, and use technologies to bring my ideas to life. Sorry, just a second. I believe art can help us make sense of the world. Artists have been using technologies since the dawn of time, whether cave paintings, glassmaking and ceramics from many thousands of years ago at the dawn of civilization, to present day technologies involving telescopes at the edge of the universe. Art allows us to express, communicate and relate to the world around us and to each other. Technologies can be the tool to do so, but they're not the essence. Art can connect to the emotions and to the hearts. So I use technologies in a subtle way. I'm going to describe just a few of the projects before the conversation. I put a microphone inside a glacier in Iceland where people could dial this number and be connected live to the sound of the glacier melting, and people called from 10,000 different places to listen to the demise of this ancient phenomena. I beam music to the moon using a very old kind of technology called Earth-Moon-Earth communication, and I sent Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata in Morse code, beamed it from the moon and back to Earth, where it plays on a self-playing digital grand piano with parts lost on the moon's surface. I created a huge map of all the dead stars in the universe with over 100 scientists from different institutes all over the world. And in this work, I was thinking about how when a star dies, even though it's so very remote from us, happening billions of years ago, it actually relates to human beings in the deepest way, because we're all made of the materials of stars dying. The planet made from these materials, the way we breathe, the way our blood runs has actually come from a star dying many, many years ago. So in my work, I'm often using new technologies to kind of analyze a very ancient human condition and how we relate to each other. I cast a meteorite and then sent it back to space with the European Space Agency, where it went to the International Space Station for 6 months before coming down and being burned up in the atmosphere. I created a piece of architecture with Zeller and Moye, where I brought together 10,000 different tree species from across the globe, from the very oldest living tree on Earth to ancient fossils and the most threatened tree species of this moment. into a kind of quiet, meditative space. I've worked with scientists to map the colours of the universe from its very beginning to its end by analysing the light of hundreds and thousands of different galaxies to figure out the colour of the first ever stars and the colour of the potential end of the universe. I am working currently to make a big commission for Apple's headquarters in Silicon Valley, where I'm actually working with architect Siller Moy to make an interactive sculpture made of sand from every desert on Earth that I'm casting into glass, which you walk around and through in a kind of mirage outside their visitor centre. And finally, this is a project that harks back to old technology of bookmaking. I've planted a forest in Oslo. It also looks to future generations. I planted a forest on the outskirts of Oslo, which in 100 years will be cut down, pulped and made into a book or a series of books written by authors from all over the world. It won't be read until the trees are cut down in the century. So it's an artwork that's for generations beyond us. We have Margaret Atwood, who wrote first, then David Mitchell, Sean, who wrote Icelandic Björk songs, Elif Shafak from Turkey, Han Kang, Karl Ove Knausgaard, Ocean Vuong, and Tsitsi Dangaremba. So I just want to end with a kind of thought on this project where when I began it 7 years ago, I was being asked questions about the technology of reading and, you know, whether Kindles and so on were going to take over the form of reading now. And in just 7 years, the questions have moved to, will there be human beings to read the book in a century? So I've found in the progression of my life, in just a few years, being faced with very, very existential questions that are kind of pressing for all of us. So I'll end there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Katie. And Evgeny, we'd like to hear from you, and then we'll dive into our discussion.
All right, I'll try to be as brief as possible, but very intense. So, not all life is equal. Bacteria, it doesn't have a choice over hardware or software. The bacteria is born in a certain form, and it has a very specific function. If we basically apply the same measurement system to human life, which is a different type of life, we don't have a choice of our form either. Our DNA essentially is a blueprint to our body. So basically, when a child is conceived, it's already pre-programmed how this child will look when he's 40, and whatever he will have certain diseases, for example. And we have an illusion of software in comparison to bacteria, because humans, they typically can learn something. We can learn Chinese, we can learn literature, we can learn how to code on Python, we can learn how to build robots. What's important is to understand that nobody can learn everything, because everybody in this room will die sooner or later, and I guarantee it's going to happen earlier than in 100 years. And it's very important to understand that as life number 2, we're doing everything to create life number 3, which is artificial intelligence. And right now it's dumb as wood, but it has a very important set of differentiators from us. First of all, it can choose its form and its software. AI can be anything. It could be a phone, it can be a driverless car, it could be a military drone, it could be a human life robot. It just, you know, life number 3 doesn't have any restrictions, honestly. And in terms of software, so what AI can learn, there's no restriction either, because actually it doesn't have this time cap, because our life's meaning is determined whenever we can write something down, so the next generation takes over. AI, as soon as AI learns something, it just becomes the best in doing this. It doesn't matter whether it's differentiating cats from dogs, or fighting a target when you're a military drone, or being in an autonomous car. It doesn't matter. What matters is just it's going to get just better and better and better. And if we take the amount of work that's done by humanity as 100%. So let's say 100 years ago, it was 100% done by mankind. And let's say right now, which is 2021, AI does roughly 2% of 100% of the work. And it's important to understand that this scale is shifting towards AI. So it's getting more and more heavy on what AI does, and we as people, we actually do fewer and fewer things. And we're looking at this, situation from the point of view of evolution. Sooner or later, it's going to be 3% of work will be done by man, and 97% will be done by AI. And the evolution would sooner or later ask, well, metaphorically, like, who is important? Who is important? This species or this, I don't know what it is, like a merge of species and technology. And it's very important to understand that in order to build Life Lambda 3, you need a ton of data, because it's all fueled by data. And this is why 70 years ago, life-looking robots and true AI, which is like super intelligence or even versions that are simpler, were not possible. When Alan Turing, for example, proposed his vision of what modern computers are, it was impossible because we didn't have any data. And right now we do, because as a comparison, in 1992 there were 1 million computers connected to the internet, just 1 million. By 2025, it would be, my team tells me, the rough estimate is about 500 billion. So 500 billion devices. Considering that we count the Internet of Things sensors and basically everything that can mine data, not just the phones and all that. And it's a tremendous difference. And it's important to understand that this is the reason why in 1992 people were called users, because we were using tools. We were using tools such as computers, and we were users. And right now, honestly, we're not users anymore. We're sensors in a system that we do not understand or control. And this tremendous power of mining this data and using it is distributed unequally. And this is why we're partly gathered here on this panel, because there are literally, I would say, 4 countries on this planet that have a true leverage, like a true leverage over the rest of the planet. And you cannot change that. It's a very important thing to understand, that if you're a company that is valuated at $1 trillion cap, you have resources to develop AI on the scale that nobody can afford. And you can buy startups just the way you want it. Price is irrelevant. You just gather in and harness in tech the minute you see it. Most people, honestly, and most countries, they do not understand what they're doing. And plus, actually, we live in an era of total surveillance. I actually wrote a book that will come in October. Unfortunately, it's too early to show it to you, but I did some calculations and I can give you one number. As species, we spend $200 billion per year on surveillance. And those are just budgets of military and intelligence services. I'm excluding companies like Google and Facebook from that, because technically they do mine data, but it's a different type of work. Just so you understand the scale, the whole moon program, the Apollo program did cost humanity about $288 billion. The whole program, all launches, all development, everything. The first launch of Saturn rocket with the crew did cost $100 billion. So we spend on surveillance per year twice as more as the moon program costs. We could go to different planets twice a year if we just stop tracking, or at least we consider what we're doing, what we're trying to solve. And my problem is, I don't know how to deal with that, because everything that we are doing right now with data mining and AI training is perceived as a good thing. And there's this word called automation, and a second word, digitalization, in most countries that heavily involved into it. Very few of them honestly understand what they're doing, and I'm consulting some of them. That's why I know. And the problem here is it looks awesome. The dark side of the moon is a couple of numbers. And a sentence I'm gonna say in a second. So basically, the dark side is that digitalization means excluding humans from making decisions, from the decision-making process. This is what it is, roughly. And the trick is, we are doing tremendous progress with it. For example, autonomous cars, they're roughly already there. It's just a matter of whatever insurance companies will start to accept this risks. Those risks, it's not related to technology anymore. And it means that in the next few years, I'm not saying like 50 years, I'm saying 5 years or 8 years, well, before 2030, we will face a couple of things. First, autonomous cars, as an example, means that if this technology becomes public, everybody who is an Uber driver right now, or a taxi driver globally, again, I did some math, and at least 20 million people globally will be, out of their jobs. Like, in a minute because it's going to be useless. I don't know how many delivery boys will be out of their jobs when autonomous delivery cars would be out there. And actually, McKinsey says, and it's a real number from their report from 2 years ago, they predict that by 2030, we will be out of 800 million jobs. 800 million. And I think they're very, very optimistic. I think that they didn't know about COVID that much, so I'm thinking 1 billion, maybe a bit more. So 1/8 of the population would be out of their jobs, and I don't see this conversation going anywhere. Like, what will those people do? Of course, there are ways of dealing with this, but this is where I'm about to end. It's an open ending. I don't know. Let's just talk about it.
That was indeed a heavy and an intense start to our conversation. So I'm going to dive into some of the topics that Evgeny has touched upon because they really are very sensitive. And probably, Koert, you can actually also join into this conversation. The idea that Evgeny was talking is that technology in and of itself is not deterministic. Am I right? So whatever we think as having in mind the humane perspective in developing a technology may then be used otherwise to the detriment of humanity. So is technology really deterministic? And if it's not, then how do we approach this dichotomy?
Well, this is a philosophical position, but I'm not a fatalist in the sense that that everything is predicted and deterministic and it will run its course. And even if I'm wrong, then I choose to live as if that's not the case, because that allows you to participate and to make decisions. Looking at the different presentations, Hiroshi, great work on building humanoid robots. The topic is the future already arrived. I think Evgeny pointed out we're already living in the robot. We're not copying ourselves as a robot that then replaces us. No, there's a robot growing around us. And this is something that we see more in the history of evolution because thousands of or billions of years ago, when cells evolved from molecules, a new structure evolved. And later, multicellular organisms evolved from cells. And we humans came from that as well. So if evolution runs its course, deterministic or not, to me it makes a lot of sense that there is a bigger superstructure, call it the matrix or the superorganism, that is evolving around us. And you could even wonder, is it already there? How would we know? How would we communicate? And the important question long term is, of course, how are we going to participate? I'm less worried about the loss of jobs. In fact, I'm not worried at all, because this is not new. My grandfather used to be a farmer. He's not alive anymore, but he was a farmer, and in his day, a large portion of all the people in my country, the Netherlands, worked as farmers. If I would have told my grandfather when he was still alive in 2021, in the Netherlands, only 1 in 250 people works as a farmer, then he would be very worried. He would say, so we're all losing our jobs. No, you're not losing your job, you're shifting, you're doing something else. Now people work as a web developer, game designer, personal coach, interior designer. All these things, new kind of roles for people emerge as well. And I think there's a risk in jobs we lose, but there are also opportunities for us as humans to live in a maybe much more desirable way. I'm waiting for the Homo ludens. That's what I'm really waiting for, the playing human. Why haven't we arrived there already with all the resources that we have? And then final remark about the planetary computer, because I'm really also interested in that, and maybe it's already there, but how do we participate in it? I'm waiting for global governments. We have nation states now, and they try to organize themselves. we need something better. We have climate change, we have deforestation, we have mass urbanization, the rise of artificial intelligence. We need to also govern at a planetary level. This is very difficult for us as human beings because we haven't evolved to live and to think on a planetary level. But I think if there's one thing that one project that we need to dive into now, it is this planetary government.
Evgeny, would you like to?
Yeah, I could comment on that. Technically, you're right. It's not the first time such amount of jobs shifted. I mean, percentage-wise. For example, before the Second World War, U.S. was mostly farmers. But when Pearl Harbor happened, basically over a couple of years, they became a totally different country, like fully committed to industrialization. But what I'm saying is, it is true, but we never faced such an amount, such a scales, because when you're changing 50 million jobs, it's different from 1 billion jobs, and and timings is very short. This is why I'm a bit concerned, but you're technically right, I agree with you. But when it comes to modern government, I mean unified government, I would vote, for that. But the problem is, from the point of view of evolution, rivalry is very important. If we create one government, people would be very relaxed. U.S. is strong right now for many reasons, but we have to admit that some of the reasons is because the USSR existed and there is rivalry with China, and China is strong for many reasons, not because of that, but because of the rivalry, they have to be stronger. And it's just, people running. If you're running alone, you'll always come slower than when you're competing. But to your point with the science thing, science doesn't care. It's, what Richard Feynman once told, and he was co-inventor of the nuclear bomb, but at the same time, nuclear power is an amazing thing. And I think the issue with science is that we have very, very many stupid people on Earth. And I don't want to offend anybody, but we invent too much in AI and too little in education, because there's 5 million people still in the 23rd century who think this planet is flat. Just literally, we have to address this issue, because people who are into science typically don't start wars, they don't misuse technology, because their level of understanding of the number of applications this technology might do is typically very, I would say, adult. And people who are just trying to compete, they try to misuse tech. That's why we still have nuclear power, or we all know it's useless. We still are disputing who has the most rockets. I'm sorry for being a bit emotional on that.
So we all agree that AI is coming, and as Evgeny said, it may be on a level of wood at the moment. However, the changes it poses, or the opportunities posed for humanity, are humongous. I think one of the challenges of the present is that we don't have a global consensus of what the desired result would be of developing AI. And I'd like to turn to Mr. Ishiguro-san. Mr. Ishiguro-san, what in your mind is the desired results of AI development for the humanity?
Basically, the most important thing is for us to develop the robot is to understand the human itself, right? So I think the technology is a way of evolution. So that is the difference from the other animals. The humans, we have two ways of evolution: the technology and of course, by improving the genes, we can have biological way of evolutions. But and we are doing so many stupid things in our histories, and then now we are crazy for the AIs. But the most important meaning of a technology development is to find the possibility of humans. Okay, so by expanding our abilities, and we are looking for the new possibility of humankind. So I'm thinking like that, right? And of course, we need to have some the discussion, the careful discussion about how to use the technologies, but at the same time, probably we never stop to develop the technologies and try to see, the more human the possibilities. And so I'm basically thinking like that.
So with the current rate of technology adoption, we may reach a computing power equivalent of 1 human in 2 years, 2023, according to Singularity University. And we may reach an computing power equivalent of all human beings by 2055, which Evgeny is very skeptical about. What are the threats that it actually poses? And I'm sure Evgeny did talk about, Marta, if you could weigh in.
Well, I am also rather skeptical of the second number that you pulled off. I don't think we're going to have such level of computation or general intelligence as such. Maybe, what, I don't know, I'm not the expert here, but what, like in 100 years?
We don't know, honestly. The AGI is very hard to know where it's going to happen. Maybe 100 years, maybe even more than that, maybe 1,000.
Maybe even never, but it is interesting, like the way how in the face of the scaling up of the problem of humans on Earth and Earth being a limited resource, that we are focusing so much on the possibility of uploading ourselves into machines, no, into this ongoing project of becoming the ghost in the machine, which for me, like maybe, you know, you have a better approach to this, but it has a lot to do with the fact that humanity has been defining itself from the very beginning as a non-human animal, as a non-nature creature, and so we've been at the top of that hierarchy that we ourselves created and that have justified our destruction of our own home until we suddenly jumped up, scaled up this hierarchy into a creature that is cleaner, healthier, and a harder worker than us, no? And we are somehow aspiring to become that clean, odorless and emotionless and deathless. It seems a paradoxical situation given the conditions that we are now in. I guess it literally reflects the lack of solutions that we have for our own misgivings, but I don't think these projections have really much to do with reality. So I don't see that the problem is there. I see that right now the idea, this projection, has become like the a mirror that doesn't that allows for the opacity of citizen control, of the development of surveillance tools for people's management and the extraction of limited resources from the earth and away from most people.
So essentially what we were talking about, how that for the entire history of the planet, which is 4.5 billion years, we have had an organic evolution, which Koert has spoke about. But the rise of high-tech in the past 50 years, it brings about a new type of evolution that is non-organic. And the changes it's bringing about are fundamental and profound. So what happens when the pace of change exceeds the human ability to cope with it? So another existential question.
I've been thinking a lot about that. And it seems to me that this is pretty much the oldest story that we've been telling each other for thousands of years, which is the idea of the ark, no? Like every time there is like a natural disaster that projects us into the future from an evolutionary perspective, only one family survives, no? And so such projecting into the future comes with a really massive sacrifice. And this is an archetype that we've been submerged in for so many years, I think. It would be very hard to shake it off. I think we are already sold into this possibility, into this jump forward into the future. So I don't know what has to happen for us to change the narrative from a planetary perspective, but also I don't even know if that narrative is always true. I don't know if we are just doomed to project ourselves in such a manner.
So with this, sorry, Koert, would you like to join?
Yeah, maybe if I may add, because I completely agree, but I think it also makes us more modest. And it's not a bad thing, because as you already mentioned, we used to see ourselves as the top of the food chain, the end of the evolution, the summit of evolution. You know, you had the microbes and they evolved, and then some monkeys, and then in the end humans. They are the summit, and that's it. But of course, things will move on, as has been pointed out, and things will change, and that makes us very modest. But we're also still connected. And the question one could ask is, in the far future, will there be a world with lots of technology and no biology? And I don't think so. I don't know, because I cannot predict, but I rather see a world in which there's a merging and a connection between biology and technology, and multi-species can thrive. Humans as one of it, connected to all the other living beings.
Well, that leads me to a question to Katie then, because Katie explores the way humans interact with the changing environment, especially the changes brought about by the technologies. Katie, how do you think art can help us understand the ever-changing world? Because for human history, humans have been able to appreciate objects of art or understand literature throughout centuries and relate to them, because these were essentially human stories. These were, whether that was a Shakespearean play or any Netflix series at the moment, it's still around a human story. It's a humanistic viewpoint. So with the changing world where we are merging with the technological environment, how does art help us make sense of it?
Well, I think, yeah, throughout human history, you know, artists have responded through communication, through expression, with the world around them. But the world around us right now has been moving at such a pace, and there's been so many extreme changes in just, you know, in the last decade. I think we all kind of need a human story. And we're kind of scrabbling to find what our story is right now because of the mass amount of changes. I think humans have become a geological force. This is the first time in the entire history of the Earth that we shaped the biosphere, the technosphere. You know, the oceans are acidified. Plastic is in our blood. We're biologically changing. We've changed almost every element of the Earth, and this has happened in just a couple of decades. We're in a very, very grave situation with the climate crisis, and immense changes have to happen from technological view. But I think when I come at it as an artist, it's to attempt to connect with some of these issues on maybe an emotional, intuitive level. It's something where we are connecting with our heart to issues that are almost so beyond us. Like, for example, you know, I've worked with astronomers and think about deep time. I look at deep time quite a lot. And they're using telescopes to look to the end or the very beginnings of the universe. We're looking at the first stars to evolve, looking at the Big Bang live. So we're actually able now, through technologies, to visualize in front of our eyes a place in the universe, not only before humans existed, but before the entire Earth existed. Now, this is such a huge kind of conceptual change, you know, from just one lifetime ago, when, you know, looking at the moon was an extraordinary discovery. Now we know there's billions of other planets, potentially other life everywhere. And we're trying to reconcile that in our capacity, in our human capacity. So, I mean, for me, art's always been a way to try to relate to issues that might seem quite beyond ourselves, and try to think about our disconnection from nature, which I think is one of the vastest issues of our time, and do so with empathy. And so, you know, I often think, what are the basic human needs what are our basic human needs, all of us across the earth? Clean air, clean water and soil. We need to eat, we need to breathe, and biology is there to save, to evolve life and to keep us alive. And I feel like we've gone so very, very far away from these basic principles of life that we have to find a new kind of interplanetary thinking, which was discussed.
Thank you, Katie. And with this, I'd like to turn to Marta, actually, which would be a continuation of some of the ideas Katie have uttered. Let's go to some of the pragmatic things that you have touched upon in your opening remarks. Let's talk about regulation versus innovation. Because I think most of the tech companies argue that a rigorous regulation really hinders innovation, whereas we now understand that the technological development really precedes regulation at the moment, and the way governments react or societies react to it is reactionary rather than proactive. This has led us using technologies. Most of us use technologies that have been developed by a handful of companies. That means only a small group of people, decision makers, are actually affecting the experiences we're having on a daily basis. Where do you see the solution to that?
Well, I think one of the interesting developments of the last few years is that while we have been, at least since 2013, when Edward Snowden made available a number of documents that proved the very symbiotic relationship of this handful of companies with the intelligence services, not only in America, but with all their allies. We've been noticing, learning, knowing that we are paying to carry handheld devices that spy on us and that basically ruin the future for us and even our children in ways that are very hard to anticipate. And yet this phenomena, this fashion of late capitalism that we've called platform capitalism or digital feudalism has only been growing ever since. It's kind of grown out of the social networks and social applications that we used to adhere this business model to into pretty much everything else, from cars to health to managing all sorts of city services to even space. So it's expanding, it's doing it real fast, and it's doing it without any particular legislation. There's so much talk about how to handle this problem, and yet it seems that the American government, for instance, finds it very hard to tackle, mostly because it's become their colonizing abilities. It's become their main tool of inserting themselves into other countries and cultures, and it's very hard to punish a dog that works for you in such a manner, I guess. But I like to compare it, for instance, with the Theranos case, especially now that we are seeing it in court. Theranos was commercializing a clinical device that was supposed to analyze blood and offer information about all sorts of diseases and conditions with just one drop. It so happened that it took 10 years to the rest of the world to establish that this ability was physically impossible, which says a lot about investors in Silicon Valley and the media. But the reason why Elizabeth Holmes, the CEO of Theranos, and her partner are in court right now is because it was commercialized as a clinical device. And the world of clinical devices is actually heavily regulated because, it deals with very vulnerable material. And yet, most of this handful of companies like Apple, Google, Facebook, etc., are entering the field of health with a whole bunch of devices and materials, and they will not be in court regardless of what they do, because the world of computing software and applications is not legislated the same way. So these two extremes are not extreme at all. Like, they're touching in so many different places, and yet people are buying these wristbands that measure everything about their health, and they will be buying these glasses that will be probably measuring their reactions, their pupil reactions to the people they see and to the movies they watch and to the things they eat in real time. And there will be two companies measuring all this information. It won't be regulated the way Theranos was. So just a thought.
Yes, Evgeny, please.
I could add to that. Actually, I couldn't agree with more, but I would differentiate and separate innovation, restriction of innovation and restriction of data mining. And I will explain what I mean. So when it comes to data mining, for the reasons of mostly of lack of STEM education globally, people do not understand, they have no idea what's going on. They just don't understand what data is, how complex it is, and what is more important, they don't understand that it's not about data, it's what about you can learn about a person or a company when you know when you have enough data and you have enough skill, basically. And I think that this question should be raised by someone on the G20 summit, that we definitely should regulate data mining. So if a person is voluntarily giving his medical data to a scientific research or a charity or whatever, and he's doing it voluntarily, fine. It should be, you know, an informed choice. But please explain what you can truly do with this data. Not just we're facing right now, like, okay, read, we respect your privacy, blah, blah, blah. I've read most of them. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't contain the truth. For example, Facebook right now is mandated by European law, which is GDPR legislation. It mandated, for example, to provide all the users with a copy of their data. Well, copy of their data is not enough. Give me what you've learned about me. Like, give me what you've learned about my preferences, whatever I'm a Republican or Democrat in US case, whether I'm straight or gay. Like, give me that. And GDPR does not regulate that yet, but still, very good initiative. But when it comes to innovation itself, the problem is all attempts to restrict that are useless and actually harmful. Because, and I can prove that, hopefully, because right now you can restrict access to the internet. You can do that. China is a good example of that, for example. But innovation is a different animal. If you restrict, let's say, AI development let's say in any country, in Mexico. Let's say you do that, just for the sake of illustration, not offending anyone. You do that, it means that all other countries, they would be better at AI because they actually are not about to restrict that. And I'm going to give you an example of cloning, by the way. Cloning, as soon as we had this Dolly case when a ship was cloned, most of the countries in the civilized world, they got together and said cloning is basically should be banned for many reasons, like because we didn't find our any language with the church or any other, religious institutes, and we don't understand how the legal will work if they're too similar, like absolutely identical people. Well, not absolutely identical, even clones they have minor differences, but still, how to deal with it legally? Like, it's impossible, so let's ban that. Well, surprise, surprise, in 2018, a Chinese team led by a brilliant doctor, I unfortunately right now cannot remember his last name, unfortunately, but they actually cloned basically a primate. They got two monkeys basically from the same cell. It means that cloning a human being, it's not a question of possible or not, it's a question of when. And the rest of the world who restricted cloning, they are far, far away from this skill. Same with artificial intelligence, same with autonomous vehicles, same with, I'm not even mentioning the military technology combined with machine learning. It's very unequal. And the problem is, I don't know how to deal with it, because from the evolutionary perspective, competition is good. But you asked whether we should restrict. Well, no. We could, but it will lead to even more inequality, like we have with cloning and CRISPR. Right now, China is #1 in the world. And I can, at least from where I am, from the technical perspective with my skill, they are #1 in anything to do with genomics. For many reasons, one of them, they didn't restrict cloning. And AI is pretty much the same. Any country that will restrict it, they would just shoot it in their leg. Same with blockchain. Why there are so many advanced countries when it comes to crypto, like Switzerland? Because Switzerland, as soon as Satoshi Nakamoto published his work, or actually I think it's a group of people, of course, it's just too good to be true that it's one man, but still, he did that and the society split. Like some countries said, yeah, it's awesome, like let's do something about it. Like Switzerland, they built a cluster in Zug, like in southern part, that just focused on fintech, specifically crypto focused. UK, Russia, US actually I think is trying to navigate because yes but no, because federal versus state regulations, blah blah blah. But right now it's an equal redistribution of expertise when it comes to blockchain. Just again, because of the restrictions. So what's the purpose? Like there's no purpose, because over time it's like with water. Like this is what I like Chinese philosophy for. There's a lot of wisdom in that. So if you try to block a river with a stone, the water will find its course somewhere, somehow. Same with innovation, it's useless. And this is why Richard Feynman, which I mentioned previously, in his book he wrote that he didn't want to create this bomb. Like he didn't want to be a part of the team that creates an atomic nuclear bomb because it was for military purposes. But then he understood like if he won't join this team, nothing will change. Like someone else will basically join and it will still achieve the same result. So innovation we just should embrace and just you know, do not mess with it. Just let the scientists do their job. They're typically very, very good with what they do.
To continue on your thought here, if the reason why I'm asking about regulation is also that the most of very important technology is being developed in very few places in the world. That means most countries are importing their technologies, which means that is deepening in economic inequality between countries and between the people. How do we reconcile, how do we address the deepening inequalities that are caused and really accelerated by technology? Some time ago, we used to think that technology was a great equalizer. Well, the pandemic has actually shown us that only the access to internet and electricity could be the greatest divide. So how do we address a growing inequality between countries that is driven by fast-paced acceleration of technology?
Well, to bring back the data problem, I wanted to put the example, or to bring the example of, for instance, the vaccine and how at the beginning of the pandemic, the reason why we did have a testing kit that was functional so quickly was because a Chinese team of specialists published the genetic information about the virus immediately, and because the brilliant Dr. Drosten that was familiar with the coronavirus was working at the Charité, which is like a public university hospital in Berlin. And so both information that came from this scientific institutions was available to the entire world immediately. And I'm pretty sure, I don't know, possibly hundreds of thousands of lives were saved as a result. We are seeing how different this development is with the vaccines, precisely because that information is never made public. It is retained by a number of companies that are obviously attached to countries where this sort of like development is well funded. But for instance, this problem is attached to a whole lot of other industries that are particularly important right now. For instance, when I think about biotech, like biotechnology and the prospect of living through a number of different pandemics in the next few years of our generation, I think a lot about how the biggest database of genetic information is in the hands of a company called 23andMe, which is, you know, a company that brings your DNA into the lab and analyzes it and has this database of millions of users that have willingly, deliberately sent their DNA in order to be, recorded. And then these companies are making use of this knowledge that is not public, and that, as the data that Evgeny was mentioning, says a lot more about us collectively than it does about each one of us individually, and also has probably the key to a lot of like valuable, like crucial life-saving solutions in the future. So it's not a case of restraining innovation. I'm totally with Evgeny in this. I think we should be just, going as far as we must. But there is a case of making sure that that information is publicly available for the right reasons in the right places, so it can be useful for all of us.
Thank you, Marta. And I think we have a question from the audience.
Yeah, that's me here. So I'm Matthew Pye, and I was on the speaker yesterday. And my question actually relates back to the pandemic and the fact that in the physical world, in the biosphere, we are evidently extremely interconnected now. And so therefore one virus has a catastrophic effect across the system. So as a naive onlooker onto the technosphere, how vulnerable are we to similar things at that level? And if we are vulnerable, how do we firewall against those cyber attacks or viruses or whatever it is?
Thank you for, is it okay if so I've spent a decent amount of years in cybersecurity, so I can, I think, give you an informed answer. So the situation is even worse than in the biological world. And the first time I learned about it, I don't know if you're familiar with my research with the biochips. So I've been living with one for 6 years now, and this is how I learned how vulnerable the IoT system, ecosystem is, how most of our medical computers are vulnerable, how all those scanners, when you go through airport, and they're basically trying to detect weapons and all that, you can actually hack that and they won't see any guns. So my point is, actually it's very messy. Thank God most people don't know about it, but the hackers do. So if you're interested in the scale of what might happen, I recommend you Google Stuxnet, the way basically it's spelled like it sounds, like it does, Stuxnet. Stuxnet was a first used cyber weapon, I think 15 years ago or 10 years ago, something like that. And basically it led to what it did, it basically addressed certain nuclear enriching centrifuges in Iran and basically broke the process. And my point is, this is just an example. It was very hard to do. This cyber weapon cost like hundreds of millions of dollars in development, and it's a huge story of what governments are behind it. But my point is, even nuclear centrifuges can be hacked. So it means that everything can be hacked. And so cybersecurity, to your point, it's never a state, it's always a process. It's always trying to build a better sheet about a better sword, roughly speaking. So I would say the expertise here is, again, very unequally redistributed all over the planet. I would say the leaders are US, China, and Russia, obviously. Like I know this field a lot. There are some amazing European countries as well who are doing a tremendous job in this field of cybersecurity, but those are typically very narrow applications. But those countries I mentioned, they know everything. They know they can do huge things. And Israel, sorry, of course, Israel. And my point is, the rest of the world, mostly they consume their solutions. They either buy them or not. And geopolitics is involved, unfortunately. So certain countries that ban their solution to be sold in certain countries, which is honestly, I think it's insane. We discuss some very vulnerable topics here. That's why I'm saying it's insane. The major threat to cybersecurity, to global cybersecurity, is the inability of the governments to admit that we are basically facing a common problem. It's not who hacked whom. It's just about, like, let's unite our efforts. What can we do? And the problem is if one country, if one hardware or software manufacturer decides that, okay, I want to join this club, hackers will say, thank you. Because this is how we get to the rest of them. So my point is, unless it's a J20 agenda, it's very hard to solve. And I'm not the only cybersecurity expert who is talking about that.
Marta, would you like to?
Yes, if I may, I mean, just to note that I totally agree. We live in interesting times regarding cybersecurity. I mean, we were always vulnerable, but now we're being hit. There is a service industry that is dedicated to hitting as many targets as possible, and there are so many of them. I guess all this network was not designed to be resilient, and I think this is the key, no? Like we think about firewalls, and actually there is a lot of talking about the balkanization of the internet, among other things, because of that reason, because it just provides a very big field of devastation for hackers and viruses, etc. But I think the key is precisely in a global resilience, and one of the yet another reason why I think relying on the infrastructure and software of 6 companies in the world creates a monoculture in terms of infrastructure that provides the best possible surface for all kinds of attacks. So I guess a diversity of solutions would probably prove more resilient than the one we currently have.
Evgeny, yes, absolutely.
Well, I would just add one thing, and it's totally agree, by the way. the only thing I forgot to say, I guess, is that we're facing new emergent threats, like the threats that we didn't face 5 years ago. To case in point, just one: digital clones. So right now, there is such a threat as social engineering. It's if someone calls you, says, "Hey," and just pretends to be a brother, a relative, a friend, because he learned that you're technically friends from Facebook or whatever. And he just say, "Hey, I need give me $10 on my account. I'm gonna call you back and tell you later what happened, blah, blah, blah." Social engineering, it's been very hard to deal with for many reasons. From technical perspective, it's very hard to deal with, but it's possible. The problem is AI is accessible to bad guys too. So if they mine long enough your social media accounts, your email and other sources of data, they can create a digital clone that will look like you, act like you, speak like you, and you can basically face an era of threats where, let's say my mother, God forbid it happens, but my mother will face a call from me because I'm a public person. My images are everywhere. So someone can build another Evgeny and just call my mother and say, pretending to be calling from Skype or Zoom and say, "Hey, I really need this," or just buy tickets, or whatever. And this is a threat that actually just blows my mind how insane it might be. So several companies, cybersecurity companies, they're trying to address that, but right now it's very hard to do for the reasons we briefly mentioned, that not all governments want to cooperate.
To add to what Evgeny has just said, it's an interesting topic of digital cloning or somebody stealing your digital identity, because I read last night at Washington Post was an article about erasing identities, actually, and China has started doing that. And a very famous actress, Zhao Wei, is reported missing in the digital world. There's not a single mentioning of her. Someone who has amassed a followership of 86 million people in the Chinese version of Twitter simply does not exist in the virtual world anymore. And for a profession like an actress, that maybe history may forget her. So that's another risk that also decision makers pose on normal people who are using these technologies.
Is it okay if I take this one as well,
Please.
just at least briefly?
Please, yeah.
You're right, and actually it's not just China. Remember Trump. I'm not against or pro-Trump. Just Twitter said you are not on Twitter anymore. You cannot do that. You are not the legislator or an executional branch of power. You're a network. You're a software provider. Be one. Just make sure that you're basically not affecting any tonality, any tone of voice. It just should be absolutely not your job. Journalistic media community or experts, they could actually, I think, influence or what's true or what not. We definitely have to do something about the fact checking, that's true. But to ban people, it shouldn't be the job of the networks. It's either governments or maybe something international to make it more secure. Because we all believe in corporate governments, well, let's create one. I'm absolutely 100% persuaded that any social network that will try to be the judge is doomed to fail, because we'll sooner or later just come as regulators and say you're not allowed to act in this country, and it's already happening. I guess that's the point. They should be banned from power of this sort.
Just sort of to conclude the fascinating discussion we had today, I'm going to ask a question, and please everyone weigh in. So how do we, let's say the next decades will be crucial in how we determine ourselves and our future. How do we ensure that we as species can be sustained on planet Earth? Can have a sustainable presence in living? And how do you see that, Koert?
Well, maybe to have a short answer to that, of course, existential question, is that we need to realize that this technology, that we put it in the world, it is the materialization of our own ingenuity. And it's, in a way, it's also a self-portrait. It's a collective self-portrait of us as humanity that we put out there in the world. And we better turn it into a beautiful artwork that we also like to relate to. And this is not certain, because much has been said about this technosphere. It's wild and unpredictable as ever, which is the irony also that we started using technology to free ourselves from the wild forces of nature. And now we created so much technology that it has its own wildness, that it becomes difficult to legislate. I also perceive this as a Wild West, and at a certain point the sheriff, we're waiting for the sheriff to come in, but the horizon is shifting so rapidly that it's difficult. The irony is that we now have to domesticate our own technologies, and this technology is also domesticating us to a certain extent, because it's tempting to think that technology only serves us, but if we're co-evolving with it, then we also serve the technology. You know, it's a co-evolutionary relationship, and I can only hope that we manage to turn it into a beautiful artwork. If not, then maybe humanity will become obsolete, but you could say then we would be the first species that came on the planet and organized surroundings that makes it impossible for ourselves to live. Well, sorry then. I think we have a chance in co-evolving with technology in a way that does in fact improve not only our lives but also all the other species and brings the planet into a new evolutionary phase. And I cannot wait to see what it will look like.
Let's turn to Mr. Ishiguro-san. Ishiguro-san, how do you see the story of the future? Is it promising? Is it exciting? Is it unsettling?
Always, you know, the other future is exciting. So I believe so that, you know, that today we have discussed the very important things and very difficult things. For example, the innovation versus the regulation. So I think, you know, it is not so easy to answer to these questions, but I believe, you know, new different technology and the science, they can solve these problems. Always, you know, we are developing a new science and new technologies, and we are, you know, developing a new types of societies, and, you know, we are overcoming the previous problems. So I think the most important thing is to keep the studying about the human societies and creating a new technology and science. So I think that is my policies, and I hope I can share this kind of policies with many people.
Thank you, Ishiguro-san. And I know Evgeny has a rather dystopian forecast for the future.
Well, it's not as dystopian. It's just everybody in this room is good with what they do, right? I'm doing my thing, and as I spend too much time with artificial forms of life, I start to, in certain ways, be skeptical about the organic one. But to your point, I'm optimistic, sincerely, because if we are all good at what we do, and some people are more pessimistic and they try to analyze what might go wrong, like I do, for example, for cybersecurity and data management, and some are optimistic in what they do, they're trying to find a really good solution in resource management and all that. I think it's just okay. This is what evolution is. Someone has to be, roughly speaking, a bad cop. Someone should be a good cop. If we're good enough and we do not fight, we will find the middle ground. And I'm actually very optimistic that we'll find all the solution. It's just all about freedom to express your true feelings and your true thoughts. This is what I'm missing. I think that the major problem of the modern society and the future, the threat to society, it's not what we've discussed today. It's the lack of platforms like this to discuss truly what you think about this or that problem. We became too vanilla. We try to not to offend a friend and when we're discussing something, well, it's a dead end, that we should be somehow looking, I'm not saying like a threat or something bad. I'm just meaning tell what you truly think. If it's truth, you cannot offend anyone with truth. So if we're truthful, it means the future is very bright. If we're lying, it's not. Yeah.
Very unexpected coming from you, Evgeny. Thank you. So, Marta, would you like to add? And then we're going to give the floor to Katie.
Well, I mean, even though these are times for great statements, like, hoping for that planetary scale government that is going to be necessary and hard to reach, I guess things are going to get much worse before they get any better. Well, we know that's already going to happen, so we need a lot of hope and a lot of will. But I think the other thing that we need, at least from an individual perspective, is to start thinking in terms of radical responsibility, of regaining responsibility over networks around us. One of the characteristics of the technologies that we've been investing so much on and devoting so many hours of our everyday life to is that they tend to remove us from the place where we physically are, away from the people that surround us in our real life, and create imaginary, new families and friends and collectivities that, listen to the same music we like and eat the same food and vote the same kind of ideologies, whatever. We need to retrace our steps and take some responsibility about the people around us, about our neighbors, our families, our colleagues, the space where we work, the flats where we live, the kindergartens where we take our kids and start establishing or re-establishing the kind of values that make us community.
Thank you, Marta. Katie, the mic is yours.
Hi. So I believe that we need to recognize there are versions of the world that came before ours, and there will be versions of the world that don't include us. We need to rebuild our connection to nature, to understand that we are nature. We're not separate. We're made of the same materials released many billions of years ago in the Big Bang. We need to understand our continuum and the perspective of deep time, expand our time horizons, and develop long-term thinking. Develop a sense of the overview effect and consider the tradition of 7 generational thinking, which is longer than a single lifetime, but not beyond human experience. And I think through that, we can develop empathy and have deeper perspectives of this moment.
Thank you, Katie. And on this note, I'd like to thank our panelists for this wonderful discussion. Thank you very much. It has been very insightful.